Hi, this is Alex from devstories.eu. OpenAPI and Swagger Ecosystem, Episode 2 of 19. Writing documentation is tedious, but what if your code wrote the docs and your docs wrote the code? This bidirectional workflow is the core promise of the open-source Swagger ecosystem. A common misconception is that you must adopt the entire ecosystem simultaneously. You do not. The toolset is entirely modular. You can pick up individual components based on your specific workflow needs, whether you are just rendering existing documentation or scaffolding a completely new backend. The primary open-source tools operate as a pipeline. You design the API in Swagger Editor, visualize it in Swagger UI, and automate implementations using Swagger Codegen. Swagger Editor is where API design begins. It is a browser-based environment where you write your OpenAPI specification in YAML or JSON. As you type, the editor continuously validates your syntax against the OpenAPI specification rules. If you misplace a field or define an invalid data type, the editor flags the error immediately. It provides a real-time split-screen view, showing the raw text on one side and a visual preview on the other. Once the contract is valid, you can move to automation with Swagger Codegen. This tool takes your OpenAPI specification file and translates it into working source code. It supports dozens of languages and frameworks. You can generate server stubs, which provide the boilerplate routing and controllers for your backend. Alternatively, you can generate client SDKs, which consumer applications use to interact with your API without having to write custom HTTP request logic. Then there is Swagger UI. This tool parses your specification and renders it as an interactive web-based documentation page. It goes beyond static text. Swagger UI generates input fields and execution buttons directly from your API definitions. Users can input parameters, attach authentication tokens, send real HTTP requests to your API endpoints, and inspect the responses right in the browser. Consider a concrete workflow combining these three tools. You start in Swagger Editor, drafting the specification for a new user management API. You define the endpoints, the request payloads, and the expected responses. Once the contract is complete, you feed that file into Swagger Codegen, configuring it to output a Node.js server stub. Codegen generates the directory structure, package configuration, and route handlers automatically. You only need to write the specific business logic and database queries inside those pre-wire controllers. Meanwhile, you give that exact same OpenAPI specification file to your QA team, served through Swagger UI. The QA engineers don't need to read your YAML file or look at your Node.js code. They open the Swagger UI webpage, see the required inputs, and start sending test payloads to your new Node.js server immediately. Here's the key insight. The open-source Swagger ecosystem shifts API development from writing back-end code and hoping the documentation stays accurate to defining a strict contract first, where the user-facing documentation and the server boilerplate are generated from the exact same source of truth. That's all for this one. Thanks for listening, and keep building.